12 News at 9. Tonight, Wichita Police providing an update on their investigation into a Sedgwick County Sheriff's deputy accused of mishandling cases in the exploited and missing children and internet crimes against children units. The department launching a hotline for people with questions or concerns about cases investigated by those two units between the years 2019 and 2024. 12 News reporter Cale Chapman spoke with the Child Advocacy Center of Sedgwick County about how important it is to investigate these cases thoroughly.
Any case that they may have been involved in, if they are concerned that it might not have been handled in the way that they want it to, that may possibly be related to the investigation that they are looking into, they would want people to go ahead and feel comfortable calling that number.
Wichita police investigating a Sedgwick County Sheriff's deputy accused of improper case closures and failure to thoroughly investigate criminal complaints in both the exploited and missing children unit and internet crimes against children unit. In a statement, Wichita police say, in part, we invite anyone who believes the sheriff's detective did not properly investigate their case between 2019 and 2024 to come forward. We want to ensure a compassionate and thorough review of their cases. CEO for Child Advocacy Center of Sedgwick County, Diana Shunn, says these cases can be complicated, and making sure they were investigated correctly can keep kids safe.
Safety is the most important thing that we and any partner looks at. Investigations are extremely important to be able to help with the safety of children, and that is really going to be their primary focus in this situation.
Shunn says when reporting a case, it's important to follow all the way through.
It's not something that may be looked at immediately or resolved immediately, but that doesn't mean that there isn't work being done.
In Wichita, Cale Chapman, 12 News.
Anyone with questions or concerns about a specific case that occurred between those years, again 2019 and 2024, is asked to call the hotline. That number right there at the bottom of your screen, that's 316-268-4500. Be sure to provide the case number and also your contact information.